As the saying goes, nothing is certain except for death and taxes. For those of us in the United States, it is that time of year again, taxes. And every year, as we sit down to file our returns, we need to deal with income brackets, property assessments, and annual deadlines. But it is not just modern taxes. The fundamental questions behind every tax system, who should pay, what should be taxed, and how much is fair, are as old as civilization itself. And the debate we're having right now about whether to tax income or wealth, whether to tax the person or the property, whether the rich are hiding too much and the poor are paying too much, is not new at all. Over 1,000 years ago, the Tang Dynasty was having a similar argument. Hi everyone, I'm Amy. Today we're going to explore the tax system of the Tang Dynasty, how it was structured, what pressure it faced, and how it was reformed. When the Tang Dynasty replaced the Sui Dynasty in 618 CE, they did not start from scratch. They inherited a tax system that was already in place, one that had been developed over generations. The Sui Dynasty used a land system that was borrowed from the earlier Northern Wei Dynasty, known as the equal field system, 均田制. The early Tang Dynasty emperors built on this system and made it the foundation for taxation for the early Tang Dynasty. The logic of this system was straightforward. In theory, the emperor owned all of the land in the empire, and under the equal field system, he distributes it to the people in exchange for taxes and services. Under this system, every healthy male adult peasant was allotted 100 mu of farmland, roughly the equivalent of about 14 acres or around 5.7 hectares. Around 80% of that was what we could think of as leased land, which meant that it returned to the state when a farmer could no longer work or died. The remaining 20% was designated for permanent crops like mulberry trees used for sorghum cultivation, and that portion could actually be passed down to your children. This land fed the peasant who worked on it, but also supported the empire. In exchange for this land, each registered adult male entered into a 3-part obligation to the state, fulfilled through his household. Yes, technically only adult males were taxed, but the taxes were paid by the household as a whole. Men worked the fields, while women produced the cloth that formed a key part of the tax. Each household was managed through a 9-tier grading system based on the number of adult males in that household. This was a system that tracked labor capacity. This was the tax system known as 租庸调. According to the new Book of Tang, if there is a field, there is a land tax, 租. If there is a household, there is a cloth tax, 调. If there is a body, there is a labor tax, 庸. So what does that mean? The first part was the land tax. Each year, a farming household paid a certain amount of grain, depending on the region. Think of it as the annual rent for the land. The second part was the cloth tax. This was paid in cloth, either silk or hemp fabric, along with a fixed amount of raw silk. The specific material varied by region, depending on what was locally produced. Even households that could not produce cloth themselves were still required to pay it. In those cases, they would obtain textiles through trade or exchange. The state did not care how the cloth was made, only that it was delivered. The third part was the labor tax. Every adult male owed the state 20 days of physical service per year, building walls, digging irrigation canals, or repairing roads. If you were in the middle of your harvest and couldn't afford to leave your fields, you were required to substitute it by paying extra cloth instead. And then there was a fourth, unwritten part of the contract, military service. The early Tang Dynasty relied on what was called the Fubing system, a model of the soldier-farmer. Under this system, peasants were expected to serve in the military when the empire needed defending. You came to war equipped at your own expense, with your own weapons, your own horse, and your own armor. In return, while a peasant was on active duty, he was exempted from his normal tax obligations. The grain, cloth, and labor tied to him were not collected, because his military service was considered to fulfill those duties instead. It was a system of mutual obligation. The state gave you land, and you gave the state labor, grain, and military service in return. In today's terms, you might think of it as a flat tax. Everyone with land paid the same fixed amount, regardless of how productive their fields were or how wealthy they had become. This was a system that depended heavily on the accuracy of its records. Now, I need to clarify that this system was built primarily around rural farming households. It assumed that most people lived on the land, grew their own food, and produced their own cloth. But not everyone fit into that model, such as urban commoners. These commoners lived in the city and could have been merchants, shop owners, or artisans. They did not rely on state-allocated land in the same way, and were often taxed through different methods, such as commercial and market taxes. Instead of paying taxes based on land allotments, they were taxed through the market themselves. Shops paid fees to operate in regulated marketplaces. Merchants were taxed on transactions and goods, and craftsmen could be subject to state labor obligations or workshop controls. In other words, while farmers were taxed through land and production, urban populations were taxed through trade, property, and economic activity. And what about the nobles and government officials? Well, they were basically not a part of this tax system at all. While exemptions varied based on rank and status, many of them did not have to pay taxes. In fact, they actually received stipends, were granted estates and land privileges, and were generally exempted from labor obligations. This meant that even though land was technically owned by the state, there was also a form of private land ownership in practice. This system we're talking about here was the ideal foundation of the Tang Dynasty economy, and for roughly a century, this system functioned well enough to support a powerful state. The Tang Dynasty population grew dramatically, and official records claim that the government was able to fill its granaries and stabilize its revenues. These accounts describe periods of abundance, with stores of grain that sometimes went unused. But that prosperity was not evenly shared. In some regions, heavy burdens and local pressure still pushed people to the edge. Rebellions like that of Chen Shuozhen, who I talked about in another video, remind us that even during this supposed golden age, the system did not work equally for everyone. The problem with a system built on distributing land in exchange for taxes and services is a simple one. Eventually, you run out of land. A century of prosperity had done exactly what prosperity tends to do. It created more people. Around 630 CE, the Tang Dynasty registered population stood at around 3 million households. By 750 CE, that number had climbed to be over 8.9 million households. That is about 3 times the people, but not 3 times the farmland. There was simply no longer enough land to distribute to every new adult male that came of age. In many districts, a young man might receive half the amount of land that was promised to him, or even less. The gap between the target allotment of land and the actual amount of land that could be assigned was widening every year. At the same time, the wealthy, high-ranking officials and powerful families had been granted permanent estates tied to their positions and families. They used this foothold to slowly absorb neighboring small farms through purchase, debt collection, or simple pressure. And as these wealthy landlords expanded their territories, more and more peasants lost their land. This is kind of similar to what we're seeing in the United States today, where investor ownership of land and housing has become one of the factors making it harder for ordinary people to own properties themselves. In the Tang Dynasty, though, this created a much more immediate problem. Because the 租庸调 tax system taxed based on registered headcount, it does not consider how much land you actually have to work on. Even though the land tax would be scaled based on how much land a peasant actually got, the cloth tax and the labor tax would not be adjusted. And as more peasants lost their land, whether they were forced out or sold it, they no longer had a direct means to survive. In many cases, these peasants became tenants under the new landowners. As tenants, they would have to pay the landowner directly instead of paying land taxes to the government. But here's the real problem. The government did not have a reliable way to update the registry in a timely and accurate manner. For many peasants who lost their land, the tax obligations did not completely disappear. They were still counted as a registered headcount and were still expected to pay their clock tax and labor tax. In some cases, they would still be charged land taxes even without land. This meant that many peasants found it harder and harder to pay their taxes and fees. And so they fled, and typically became lost from the records. These displaced farmers essentially became unregistered peasants. And with more peasants losing their land or becoming displaced, the total amount of taxes that could be collected dropped significantly. But the government still needed revenue, and local officials still had quotas and expectations that they had to fulfill. So they were forced to put more pressure on the remaining households, sometimes through increases in local taxes. It is not entirely unlike what happens today when taxable wealth becomes harder to reach. The burden does not disappear. It falls more heavily on those who remain within the system. This created a punishing cycle. The more people lost land or left, the heavier the load fell on those who remained. The heavier the load, the more people lost their land or chose to leave. The system was trying to collect the same amount of taxes when there were much fewer people to collect from. In theory, the state could reclaim and redistribute land, but in practice, it lacked the power to enforce those rules against wealthy families and entrenched local interests. The military felt this just as sharply. The Fubing system depended entirely on a class of farmers who were able to equip themselves for war. By the 740s, that class was shrinking fast. A man too poor to keep his land could not afford a boat, let alone a horse and a set of armor. And as more farmers became displaced, the number of men available for service through the Fubing system also shrunk. The Tang Dynasty government responded by transitioning to paid soldiers, the Mubing. It was a practical solution to a real problem, but it carried an enormous consequence. Unlike the Fubing soldier who fought in exchange for his land allotment, the Mubing soldier expected cash wages. This meant the government now needed a constant and reliable flow of money, precisely at the moment when its tax base was quietly dissolving. But it was not just poverty that weakened the system. The nature of warfare had changed. Campaigns along the northern and western frontiers became longer and more demanding, with soldiers stationed far from home for extended periods. A system built on part-time farmer soldiers could not sustain that kind of war. By the time Emperor Shenzong reached the later years of his reign, the equal field system was no longer working right. The registers were out of date. The land was in the wrong hands, and the army on the northern frontier was increasingly staffed by soldiers who answered not to the emperor in Chang'an, but to the powerful regional commanders who paid their salaries. These commanders controlled both military forces and the regional administration, with power that increasingly rivaled that of the central government. And in 755 CE, everything came apart all at once. One of those commanders, a general named Anlushan, marched on the capital, starting the chaos of the Anlushan rebellion. The Anlushan rebellion lasted 8 years, from 755 to 763 CE. By the time it was over, the Tang Dynasty was fundamentally changed. The human cost was considerable. Millions of people were killed, displaced, or simply disappeared from official records. Chang'an itself was captured and sacked. The imperial court fled south, and the state registers that had recorded every household, every plot of farmland, and every tax obligation across the empire were destroyed, scattered, or abandoned in the chaos. When the dynasty finally stabilized, the government tried to rebuild its records. According to historical accounts, the number of registered taxable households had fallen to around 1.9 million, a massive drop from the previously recorded 8.9 million. But this did not mean that most of the population was gone. While many people did die, many more were simply no longer properly tracked. The 租庸调 tax system, already struggling before the war, was now simply unworkable. You cannot collect a head tax when you cannot find the heads. The government could no longer rely on its traditional tax system. It needed a new way to generate revenue. And so, it turned to one of the most profitable commodities in the empire, salt. Rather than managing the entire trade directly, the government reorganized the system into a state-controlled monopoly. Producers were required to sell salt to the government at a controlled price. The government then sold that salt to licensed merchants at a higher price. And those merchants transported and sold it to people at an even higher price for a profit. The government used salt as a lifeline and turned merchants into an important part of the state's revenue system. But while this worked out for the government, it certainly increased costs for the peasants, and was an example of why people didn't like merchants. I talked about this a little bit in my previous video about merchants. Meanwhile, local officials who had lost their regular tax income invented their own solutions. One was the green sprout tax, a tax collected on crops that had not even been harvested yet. Then there was also the 地头钱, a tax for simply occupying a piece of land, regardless of how much it actually produced. This was an additional fee on top of the existing tax system. What is important to understand here is not just the financial chaos, but the conceptual shift happening underneath it. By taxing land use and taxing crops before they even existed, local officials were already moving away from taxing people and toward taxing land and production directly. The old tax system was being quietly replaced by new ideas. And what the empire needed was someone to turn these ideas into an official policy. In 780 CE, the Chancellor Yang implemented a new tax system that would define how taxes worked for China for the next several centuries. Yang served as a chancellor for Emperor Dezong, who came to the throne in 779 CE with a government struggling to fund itself. Yang diagnosis was practical. The equal field system was no longer viable. The population records were no longer reliable, and the empire was trying to collect taxes according to a register of citizens that no longer matched reality. His answer was the two tax law. He said that households shall no longer be distinguished as native or migrant, but shall be registered based on the current residence. Individuals shall no longer be distinguished by their age or status, but shall be taxed based on their wealth and assets. At first glance, this sounds like a much fairer system. This meant that citizens were no longer paid taxes based on where they were registered. Instead, they would pay based on where they actually lived. This directly addressed the problem of displaced peasants being able to avoid taxes. And it also means that a greater tax burden doesn't fall onto you if you were just a law-abiding citizen and your neighbors tried running away. In addition, the taxes were no longer fixed based on an adult male status. Instead, it was relative to how much land or property you owned or had access to, and how much wealth you actually had. This was still managed through a 9-tier grading system, but it now graded wealth instead of labor capacity, ranging from the richest upper-class households down to the poorest lower-class households. Your tax obligations rose or fell with your tier. It was kind of like the progressive tax bracket that we're familiar with today. This sounds great, right? The rich paid more, the poor paid less, and it feels kind of modern. Well, but then I know some rich people today basically pay no taxes, but we won't get into that here. And it was called the two tax law because the taxes were collected twice a year, once in the summer and once in autumn. Well, why does that matter? You see, summer was usually the early harvest, and autumn was usually the main harvest. These were moments of the year when a peasant actually had something to pay with. By lining up tax collection with harvest and at predictable deadlines, it made paying taxes a lot easier for households to manage. Now, this change didn't just affect the farmers. Under the old system, merchants and urban populations were taxed separately through markets and trade. But the two tax law was tied to wealth itself. That meant merchants, shop owners, and anyone accumulating property were more directly drawn into the tax system as well. Instead of being taxed only through commercial activity, they could now be taxed based on the wealth and properties they held. And finally, because wealth was taxed directly, nobles and officials were now also taxed based on what they had. But there was one more important change. Taxes shifted towards being required to be paid in money, specifically in copper cash. Not silk, not grain, not labor days, just currency. Now, for obvious reasons, this could not be implemented everywhere immediately. Depending on region and local conditions, grain and cloth payment were still accepted in practice. This was a practical necessity. The government needed to pay its professional soldiers in coin, but collecting millions of different bolts of silk of varying quality and converting them to cash was an administrative nightmare. A standardized monetary payment was far simpler to manage. In practical terms, the two tax law was a much more workable system than what it replaced. Revenue stabilized, and the imperial budget became more manageable. But what looked like a solution from the top felt very different from the bottom. You see, most peasants did not have copper coins. Peasants had grain and they could make cloth. But to get copper coins, they had to sell what they had first. And because every peasant in the empire was doing the same thing at the same time in order to pay taxes, the market was flooded. Naturally, the prices for what the peasants were trying to sell went down, and the value of copper, suddenly in enormous demand, went up. It was basically deflation, and it was bad for the peasants. The government had not raised the tax, but by demanding it in a specific form of currency, they had effectively made it more expensive to pay. And in 794 CE, the Chancellor Lu Zhi criticized the situation by saying, "In the past, when you handed over one bolt of silk, it was worth 3,200 or 3,300 copper coins. Today, that same bolt of silk is worth only 1,500 or 1,600. Back then, you only had to give one bolt to pay your taxes. Now you have to give more than two." Even though the government claims they haven't raised their taxes, in reality, what you're forced to pay has doubled. There was also a deeper structural problem. By taxing property rather than person, the two tax law implicitly recognized private land ownership in a way the old system never did. Under the old equal field system, the state tried to control the distribution of land. But under the new system, the state stopped trying to manage land distribution and just taxed whoever held the land. This meant that the state was kind of recognizing private control of that land. Large landowners who had long been quietly expanding their holdings could now better defend their land ownership. They were the ones paying the taxes on that land after all. But wait, if the state was no longer distributing land, how would a peasant get land to work on? So under the new system, there was typically three ways. First, if your family already had land, you could inherit it. Second, you could buy or rent land if you could afford it. And last, you could work for a landlord, which would gradually become the most common method. Chancellor Lu Zhi recognized how this could ultimately be worse for the peasant, and he said, "The poor have no place to stand. They rely on the powerful and wealthy and become their private subjects." The small independent peasant was gradually being replaced by the tenant farmer. This was a farmer who worked the land he did not own, paid a portion of his harvest to a landlord rather than to the state, and owed his livelihood not directly to the emperor, but instead to someone else's property. And while taxing wealth seemed to make sense, this burden did not fall evenly on the population. Peasants tied to the land had no choice but to sell what they produced. But merchants and urban populations were in a very different position. They could move their goods, shift their operations, or conceal their assets in ways that land-bound farmers could not. Their wealth was more mobile, harder to measure, and easier to conceal. So while the system was designed to tax wealth, in practice, it still taxed what was easiest to see. Sound familiar? But even though these problems were recognized, it unfortunately didn't matter. The two-tax law was not designed to be fair. It was designed to work. The old system had already collapsed, and there was no realistic way to return to it. The government needed a stable and predictable source of revenue, and the two-tax law was able to deliver that. Even if it did create some new problems for peasants in the long run. Officials like Lu Zhi did propose adjustments and warn about the burden on the people, but these efforts could only modify the system, not replace it. The underlying structure remained the same. And to make things worse, over the following decades, local government began adding additional fees and taxes on top of the two annual payments. The predictability and the simplicity of the original two-tax law system gradually eroded. By the end of the Tang Dynasty, peasants were once again paying a complicated mess of fees and taxes that nobody could really understand. But even with its flaws, the two-tax law was a dependable tax system, at least for the government, and it would be used for the next several hundred years, all the way to the Ming Dynasty. The story of the Tang Dynasty tax system is about questions that never really get resolved. Should you tax the person or the property? Should everyone pay the same flat rate, or should the burden rise with wealth? What happens when the people who can't afford to pay find ways to avoid it, and the people who cannot afford to pay are left holding the bill? These questions could not be answered in the Tang Dynasty and are not even really answered today. But one thing for sure is that we all have to pay taxes. So definitely don't forget to pay yours. What do you think about these different forms of taxation? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed today's topic, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
Stay curious, stay magical.